Welcome, everybody, to In the Spotlight. I am here today with Steve Goreham, who is an expert on the energy sector. In fact, I'm going to read to you a little bit about his background. Steve Goreham is Executive Director of the Climate Science Coalition of America and author of 3 books on energy, climate change, and sustainable development, with over 100,000 copies in print. His latest book, Outside the Green Box, Rethinking Sustainable Development, tells readers what their green consultant didn't tell them. I've known Steve now for probably 3 years, and as a state representative, I had him in to discuss energy issues with a variety of legislators down in Springfield when we were debating renewable portfolio standards. So Steve and I go back a ways. He's brilliant on this topic, and he's very conversational for the average user of this type of information. So we're going to get at it. This is a really important interview that I want you to all pay attention to, because especially with the Texas blackouts that happened just 3 short weeks ago, it seems, with 60-degree weather coming along right now, that we have forgotten about that. But this is an issue that we need to discuss in full, because it's got policy implications for the future, and whether or not we're focused on the right issues. In my opinion, that is essentially making sure that our infrastructure is sound enough to sustain these types of temperatures and is not necessarily adding to the renewable mix. So Steve, let's just start right there with what happened in the Texas blackout. Can you kind of give us an idea about that? And I'm going to just briefly tell you a couple things. Both the NPR had a story, Forbes had a story not shortly after, and says basically, no, the blackouts in Texas weren't caused by renewables. Here's what really happened. And they go in specifically to say, and I'm quoting from this NPR article, this week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott appeared on local TV in Dallas and blamed the state's power crisis on the devastating storm that disrupted power generation and froze natural gas pipelines. He didn't single out one power source to blame. Then he went on Fox News and gave a different story. He said wind and solar got shut down. They were collectively more than 10% of our power grid, and that thrust Texas into a situation where it was lacking power on a statewide basis. So it sounds like they're complaining that Abbott wants to have it both ways. He wants to say that they weren't a problem, wind and solar weren't a problem, and then he wants to say, yes, they were a problem. What's the truth here?
Well, Jeanne, great to join you, and thanks so much for that generous introduction. Yeah, Texas is an amazing thing. There have been a lot of articles written. And Texas has had fairly low prices. They deregulated about 7-8 years ago, and their energy prices actually have risen lower than the national average. But they really got hit in February. Now, in 2020, they got 53% of their electricity from gas, 17% from wind. And when this cold snap hit, a number of things happened. The first is they just ran out of gas supply. The demand was so big that they could not get enough gas in. And so they had to shut down a bunch of gas power plants. That was a big deal. Second was that their wind turbines froze up. And I sent you a nice image on a wind turbine frozen over. Your viewers can see that. And so those completely went down. But there's even a bigger factor, and that is somehow Texas, the utilities didn't think they need to winterize their systems. I'm not sure where they got that idea. Maybe they thought it wasn't going to get cold again, but the cold weather was about equal what they had in the 1990s. But they didn't put measures in either the gas or the electricity systems that would allow them to get through a cold situation like this. And so they had 4 million people without electricity for up to 4 or 5 days. And what's almost as bad, maybe even worse, was that the prices of electricity went up by a factor of 75. There are a number of stories about people that paid $230 in January for electricity and were charged $10,000 for those 4 days when they had electricity. So I'm sort of thinking, wow, if I was down in Texas and I could see the future, I probably would have shut my electricity off and not had power for 4 days. Who can afford a $10,000 electricity bill? It's really nuts. The Power Commission in Texas has ruled that they're not going to get rid of those bills. People have to pay them. So there's going to be a bunch of class action suits against the utilities. People are banding up, but it's just remarkable. I mean, it's the unfortunate situation is that the utilities in Texas got rid of all their coal plants. By the way, coal, there's some issues with pollution. You put scrubbers on, you solve those problems, but you can pile up coal on your yard, and then you've always got it to burn, where gas is much tougher to store. They do it in some underground reservoirs, but much tougher to store. When you run out, you're in big trouble. And so the utilities have suppressed the two primary directives that they used to have. One was ratepayer cost and the other was reliability. Now they've put green energy ahead of those with unfortunate consequences.
Well, so it's remarkable too. In 2014, Illinois experienced a polar vortex, but for the fact that we are a large nuclear producer and we had lots of nuclear power available to us that kept operating 98% of the time, we would have also seen similar blackouts in our state, but that didn't happen to us. Now, Texas doesn't have a lot of nuclear power, that's my understanding, and they've had this over-reliance on renewable energy. In some cases, apparently it's up to 25% of their actual capacity. It doesn't mean that that's what they use, but that's what they're capable of doing, because capacity is different than actual use. So they've wanted it all in Texas, right? The fossil fuels, which that's what they're known for, oil and gas. But the truth is, my husband has been down into West Texas building wind energy, about 10 years ago. So they've bought into this whole thing too, because in many cases, the energy companies are kind of in on it with the renewables. Am I wrong?
Yeah, they are. A lot of the utilities have sold out, unfortunately, the ratepayer. Another story that was not discussed was what happened in Oklahoma. The two biggest, because Texas dominated all the press,
yes. But
the two biggest wind states in the country are Texas, number one, Oklahoma, number two. And Oklahoma actually last year got 34% of their electricity from the grid. Well, all their wind turbines went down. The governor down there, I'm quoting him, said, "We're not getting the wind. Some of the stuff is frozen. We've got ice on the propellers." And so they had 400,000 people without power for many days as well. And so you see, funny coincidence, the two biggest wind states have these big blackouts in the cold weather and big problems. And I think, unfortunately, utilities and citizens are going to have to learn the hard way about some of these renewable issues.
So, but that we're not unfamiliar with this. It just seems that, like in California, it was a different result. It was a different reason that they had rolling blackouts. If you want to, could you talk a little bit to that? Because there is a similarity here, and it seems to be with the renewable industry where you're having these rolling blackouts.
Yeah, same thing. California in August had wide rolling blackouts, wide area. Covered much of the central part of the state. California is now up to 14% solar in 2019 and 7% wind, but they get more than that in the summer. They get about 20% from solar. But when you get to 6 o'clock and the sun starts going down, by 7 o'clock there's no solar. And if they had any failures, and what they did was they had another plant or two come offline, they have these wide area blackouts. They have to shut down power for people. They just don't have enough electricity reserve. And they've done a number of things. They've cut their nuclear plants in half. They closed 11 coal plants since 2007. Even their natural gas generation is down 10% since 2013. So they don't have enough. And again, that is clearly a case of renewables being the issue, intermittent renewables. And the more and more these states go in for these renewables, the more and more problems we're going to have with blackouts and very high costs.
So is there a place at all for wind and solar? I would say personally, maybe there is, in a niche way, in particular targeted, very focused uses. I would not say that large scale that it's actually viable, especially if you're using it as part of the capacity market, which there are congressmen, including Sean Casten, who thinks that that's a viable idea. I don't think it is. And, certainly I grew up hanging the clothes out to dry. And what was the energy source there? The wind and the sun. So it works in niche environments, and it maybe works in California, but you've told me before that, putting solar in Illinois is like trying to grow a pineapple here. It just doesn't work.
If you're in Hawaii and you don't have pipelines going out there, you can't get hydrocarbons. There's lots of wind, there's lots of sun. It becomes very cost effective. Some of the southern states, I think it can work. The big problem is, though, that is the intermittency. Mm-hmm. And utility managers have found they can count on about 10% of the nameplate capacity as a capacity addition. So if you add a 100 megawatt solar facility, you can only count on about 10 megawatts as a capacity addition. So as these states strive for 100% renewable, and we now have 10 states that have said they're going to be 100% renewable electricity by 2040 or 2050, there is a bill in Illinois right now, I think you know about, where they're trying to pass the same sort of thing. What you end up doing is, as you add more and more wind and solar, you still have to keep the traditional power around. You have to keep 90% of the coal or nuclear or natural gas plants. And so now you end up doubling or tripling your capacity, and then your price goes way up. You have to run these, the traditional plants at lower effectiveness, lower utilization. And so prices are going to go way, way up. And unfortunately, consumers are going to pay for this until they start voting against it.
Well, I mean, you could just look to Germany, and I know you have talked a lot about the European market and what they have learned by investing in large-scale wind to the detriment of coal or other natural gas resources. And I talked to a specific manufacturer. He is a subsidiary of a German company. He's got a manufacturing plant right here in the Downers Grove area. And he says, if I'm looking at Germany, you're paying about 24 cents a kilowatt. In the US, I'm paying 6 cents a kilowatt. I mean, this is a huge price issue when it comes to manufacturing and having to sell a product at a market price. Right.
And I provided you with a chart, which you may be able to get up there at some point. But you hear a lot of headlines now saying that wind and solar are cheaper. Awful lot of headlines for that. The problem is, so if you look at reality and you look at the nations that have put in a lot of wind and solar, I've given you a graph of Europe, and it has the wind and solar capacity per person, so divided by population for each nature on the vertical axis, and along the horizontal axis, it has the electricity price. And the trend is that more and more wind and solar means higher and higher electricity prices. If wind and solar were cheaper, that curve would go the other way. The people that put in more wind and solar would have the lowest prices, but it isn't the case. And as you say, Denmark and Germany more than 3 times the U.S. price today. So, and by the way, we have some states heading that way: California, Michigan, the Northeast, a bunch of them. What people are going to see is rising energy prices.
So why? At the end of the day, why this fascination with wind and solar? It has certainly come about as a part of what they call the climate crisis, right? And you, like me, you have taught me well, so to speak. I mean, the climate is always changing. So, and I was reading from a Cooler Heads email earlier today, and it's just remarkable. What does it say here?
Good group.
Yeah, that is a good group. It says here as an excerpt from the Risk of Communicating Extreme Climate Forecasts. It says that Carnegie Mellon University's David Rode and Paul Fishbeck collected 79 predictions of climate-caused apocalypse going back to the first Earth Day in 1970. 48 of the predictions, which is 61% of the predictions, have already expired as of the end of 2020. From a forecasting perspective, the problem is not only that all of the expired forecasts were wrong, but also that so many of them never admitted to any uncertainty about the date. So you've got these sensational predictions about what's going to happen in the future, and that's what's driven this idea that we need these renewables. There's a whole way we can go with this conversation. One is you have an awakening of how renewables may not be the greenest thing. After all, Michael Moore did The Planet of the Humans, which I encourage people to watch. You have Michael Schellenberger writing a book called Apocalypse Never. He was a true believer in all of the climate scare information, and he admits that he overstated that. So I'm hoping that on a policy front that we confront these climate scares and talk about what realistically is possible and what is the best way to get there. It's not really building a windmill with 100 tons of concrete at its base and making massive fins for it that are not biodegradable, that take on are really, really tough carbonized material that you literally have to build a special saw to even cut through to bury them into a landfill. Is that green? Is that any?
Right. Yeah, that's going to be a big issue. They're now forecasting that the amount of waste from solar is going to be bigger than total global plastic by 2050. And the amount of waste from wind turbines is going to be bigger than total global plastic waste in 2050. So the number is going to be very big. And some of the predictions you talk about really excellent. Dr. David Viner of Climate Research Unit in England, 2007, said snow is going to be a rare event. Kids won't even know what snow is. Right? Ask the folks in Chicago and New York. Al Gore predicted all the Arctic ice was going to be gone in the summer of 2014. Didn't happen. The United Nations said we're going to have 50 million climate refugees by 2010. Well, they moved that date out to 2050. A lot of times the disasters just end up with dates moving out. But the other thing is, there's no doubt that global emissions of carbon dioxide are going to increase. We have 800 million people now, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, all trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But the other 8 billion people on the planet, China, India, all of the third world are emitting more and more and more. So it really doesn't matter what we do here in Illinois. It's not going to have a significant effect. We need to get back to the top two priorities for our energy, which are cost and reliability.
Right. And with that comes resiliency, for sure. So you don't think it's prudent for the California city to be the first in the U.S. to ban new gas stations? Is that a prudent thing for them to do?
Yeah, isn't that something? Petaluma, California has said you can't build a new gas station. You can't expand any gas stations. They want everybody to drive electric cars. That's 1 or 2% of the U.S. market right now. It is higher in some other places, but we're going to have to see. I think electric cars will get up to be about 15% of global cars by 2050. Still a huge market, but this idea that we ought to ban them in our states, not anybody buy them. Thank you, but I'd like to keep my pickup truck and I'd like to keep my gas stove. Let's give people choices and not be climate dictators about all this sort of thing.
Well, on the margin too, you can do a lot as an individual personally to decrease your own energy use, and it doesn't need to be mandated. It just is smart to do it if you want to save money. So, if you do want to hang out your clothes to dry, go ahead, do that. If you want us to drive a smaller car, that's up to you. I mean, in terms of building efficiency, which we have a lot of mandates too as well now, new mandates on building efficiency. And I don't know, maybe you have some information on that, but the ROI on some of that stuff is very negligible when you go out to having to what do they call it? LEED certified levels 1, 2, and 3, whatever it is, gold, silver, whatever, platinum, I don't know. When you look at that, the cost versus what you're saving in energy, it sometimes does not make sense.
It's pretty small. And right. A lot of these energy efficiency incentives don't really stick with the population. They found studies that say, well, they can offer these benefits and people don't really do it. But California right now, I think they have 10% of the population has banned gas stoves, gas furnaces, and new construction. They want everybody to go electric. The great thing there is when the power goes off, not only will you not be able to turn your lights on, you won't be able to cook anything, you won't be able to heat your house, and you won't be able to run your car too. Everybody will have electric cars. So they're really heading for a great situation out there.
Well, speaking of cars, let's just go back a little bit here. You had a great analogy on how to explain using the family car as why renewables are not the best source of energy. Can
Yeah, it's yeah, I like to use the two different cars. One of them runs almost all the time that you have. But what the government is doing is saying you have to take this second car that runs only 30% of the time. And so you can't replace your other car with it because sometimes it doesn't work. That's like wind and solar. Wind only runs maybe 30% of the time, solar about 16, 70% of the time. But let's force everybody to use this renewable car, and they still got to keep their old one. Their costs go up. Very much what our utilities are facing today. They're being forced by the state governments to do this, and by and large, they've given in to all this at the expense of the ratepayer.
Well, but the nonsense isn't starting. Just in the last week, in Congress, they have rolled out again a number of bills that basically want to, get rid of fossil fuels by 2030, 2035. And so they haven't woken up. I mean, maybe they haven't listened to Michael Moore, one of the left's favorite producers on the planet Human. Why this seems so logical. It seems actually scientific as the path to go forward, and what should be actually worked on is resiliency in our energy markets. And why are the politicians, why can they not get a grip on this? I don't understand it.
Well, ideology is powerful, unfortunately, and we have one political party, and we have many of the leaders of the world that think they must do this to stop the planet from warming. The crazy thing is that warm weather is actually better. I had to consider, my wife and I bought a condo in Virginia Beach, which is where I am today, and it's 6 degrees Celsius. So we spent part of the year in Chicago and part in Virginia Beach. Well, it's 6 degrees Celsius warmer on average in Virginia Beach than Chicago. So I have to say, well, am I endangering my health, my wife's health, right? Because I'm moving to a warmer climate. That's what the government says. Warm climates are dangerous.
But also you're moving near the ocean, and aren't the seas going to rise?
Seas are going to rise as well. Yeah, 7 inches per century is what they've been rising. So yeah, we're only 500 feet from the ocean. So we'll see. And the cost of all the land here doesn't seem to be going down. It's the ocean land is going up. Go figure. But my question for your viewers is, well, why do people retire to Texas and Florida and New Mexico, Arizona? Don't they know warm climates are dangerous? They should be going to Saskatchewan when they retire, or Alaska, or wherever. I mean, it's beyond common sense. It really is what the government is doing and what the prevailing public view is on this.
It's also closing out really to underdeveloped countries the ability to grow their economies through cheap fossil fuels. Cheap, reliable fossil fuels. And I think that's pretty shameful too. So now that we are a first world economy, we are going to deny that type of growth to others throughout the world. The World Bank has set a ban for a while on lending for coal-fired facilities to third nations. They'd rather have people without electricity. China is the only one stepping up in that area. And there's even a bigger issue that's come up. Europe is now considering to put up carbon import taxes, which means if you don't produce your products with renewable energy, you're going to pay a tax when it comes across our borders. And of course, they're going to impose this on places like Brazil and Africa and Indonesia and everywhere else. Really, really sad and very misguided. And it's not going to have any measurable effect on global temperatures. That's the bottom line. But it sure is going to it potentially could impact the economies of these nations. Let's get back to global impact on temperatures in a moment, but I want to go down that path a little bit more, where you talked to me earlier about the imports of fuel into the United States and how we have become energy independent really over the last 10 years. And you had some really interesting statistics that you had told me earlier.
Yeah, I'm going to send you a chart on that so you can add it to this. But, we had the oil shocks in the 1970s. We had Arab oil embargo that was embargoing nations that were supporting Israel. And we had another oil shock in Iran. About 79. So all through the 70s, our oil prices went way up by factors of 3 and 4, and our imports were going up at the same time. U.S. percentage of oil products used went from about 20% in 1970 And we tried to put in all kinds of things to stop the rise. Went all the way up to 60% in 2006. We had the CAFE standards come in for mileage for cars. We had ethanol subsidies. Didn't affect it at all. 2006. By 2011, we had a $350 billion trade deficit in energy. We were importing all this oil from the Middle East. Well, the frackers got busy, the hydraulic fracturers in the United States, and this curve just takes this huge turn and drops all the way down to zero. In 2020, we were actually a net exporter of energy. It went from 60% imports to zero in 2020. And our trade deficit went from $350 billion negative to slightly positive, first time in more than 50 years. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the Biden administration and the Congress is going to try and shift things back the other way so that we're importing all this oil, shut down all our producers. So hopefully that won't occur.
But at one point, oil prices were actually negative. You had a negative spot price for oil, and
they were in April, with the COVID situation.
With the COVID situation, you didn't have airplanes flying and everything else, and now they're back up to what, $65, $75 a barrel, where fracking is profitable again. You could actually, a lot of that industry could come back. Those are really good paying jobs for folks. That
will help. Yep.
Yeah, it would definitely.
A lot depends on what Congress will do. I'm hoping the Senate will hold out and stop a lot of these crazy measures and give people a choice. Energy, we ought to have wind and solar and hydrocarbons compete based on price, reliability, real environmental impact, and not impose all these things because we're afraid the planet is going to warm. Again, we can do it on another session sometime, but the evidence for that's very shaky.
Okay, great. So that is, we will talk about that. I know 20,000 years ago, this was pretty much a sheet of ice where we're sitting right now. And well before the Industrial Revolution, did all of that tend to melt away and create, really, in the state of Illinois, some of the most fertile farmland in the world. So that is a whole nother conversation, but you are an expert in that area. So as we leave this discussion about what happened in Texas, blackouts, how to go forward, I think I really want people to focus on two things. One, policy matters in this area. It 100% matters. If you're going to bar folks from further fracking contracts on lands, then you're going to have a problem with your energy supply in the future. And so what do you suggest, though, for the readers? You've been at this a while, trying to connect dots for people so that they wake up and make America the leading economic engine, because we believe capitalism works for most folks. And we believe that, in order to actually improve people's lives, they have to have a reliable energy source, reliable and cheap energy source. That's what improves people's lives. So how do we take this forward with people? What can people listening to this interview do?
Well, I do recommend, I'll make a plug, they should go to stevegorham.com and look for my 3 books. They're color, they're very easy to read. They'll give them the facts on energy and climate. But we're in for, if the left gets its way, they're going to want to prevent you from buying a internal combustion engine car. They want to take away your natural gas furnaces and stoves. It's going to be very tough, and your electricity rates are going to go up and up and up, and the reliability is likely to go down. So people need to get educated on energy, and they need to start demanding that our utilities and our companies get back to reliable energy and low-cost energy, and quit chasing these concerns about man-made global warming.
Okay, well, there you go. You've heard from Steve Goreham. I appreciate you coming on this discussion. There's so much more to talk about with this issue. We are going to definitely have you back about more things. The use of fossil fuels is more than just fueling our economy. It also goes into all sorts of other beneficial things that serve us terrifically, from the plastics industry to polyester industry, to everything else that people use and consume on a daily basis comes from fossil fuels. And we need to appreciate the power of those fossil fuels and the scientists who have figured out how to make it so their use beneficial for everyone in the world. So thank you again, Steve, for coming on this. I really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Jeanne. My pleasure.
Take care.